First, I'm not really an expert in arms trafficking. I'm more of a general layman interested in how the world operates. Second, it's impossible to convey the many intricacies of Victor Boot's exploits in 20 minutes. I'm going to give you a thumbnail sketch. And third, these are my own opinions and don't reflect those of DoD, the Army, or the Foreign Military Studies Office. The premise of my talk is pretty simple. Despite what today's headlines might suggest, or the exploits of Victor Boot, war is not good for business. There may be some short-term gains, but in the long run, war and its attendant evils come back to haunt those who traffic in this deadly business. I first became interested in Victor Boot when I was researching what happened to the huge stockpiles amassed during the Cold War, on both sides, but primarily on the Soviet side. For nearly a half century, the USSR gathered weapons to protect and perhaps expand the worker state. Indeed, armaments were one of the few areas of production where the Soviet Union could compete with the West. This map is from the 1988 version of Soviet military power and was published by the Department of Defense. It displays how U.S. analysts envisioned how the Soviet Union might attack into Europe. There were mountains of weapons produced by both sides during the Cold War. And like the shotgun hanging in Anton Chekhov's play Uncle Vanya, sooner or later these weapons would be put to use. But as a force-on-force conflict in Europe would likely have led to an Armageddon of some sort, the Cold War protagonists had to look for other areas to win our hearts and minds. The African continent provided many rich opportunities. Given their unjust colonial backgrounds, a handful of the new countries in the region were susceptible to Marxist doctrine. Many of the local warlords or revolutionaries would willingly spout their belief in the communist cause in exchange for weapons, which the Soviets and others were willing to provide. This map reflects some of this proxy fight. Then, lo and behold, the Cold War ended. And while there were no overt victory parades, many now claimed that democracy and capitalism had proved superior to communism with its one-party system and government-controlled economy. Besides, however, multi-party elections and a capitalist economy, the idea of expanding markets and prosperity were guiding principles for many of the new countries. As you know, the transition from a communist to a capitalist economy for those in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union was not easy. Though they had, with the collapse of the old Marxist norms, those ideas of right and wrong, legal and illegal, private and state became blurred. While most suffered from severe economic distress, including many soldiers, those with connections and ambition, and perhaps a lack of scruples, could make a fortune by taking advantage of this gray area. And one of those was Victor Boot. Just quickly, a little bit about his background. Born in 1967 in Dushanbe in Tajikistan. When the Cold War ended, he was a Soviet military translator working in their GRU, or military intelligence. He had been stationed in Mozambique during the 80s, where he had picked up firsthand knowledge of the language, culture, and most importantly, a good client list. There are questions as to where he got his startup money. Some say that folks within the GRU helped him out. I couldn't corroborate that. But it wouldn't have taken much. In the early 90s, Russia had an abundance of military transport aircraft, unemployed pilots, and excess weaponry. Victor Boot also had this willing list of former customers. The Cold War may have ended in Europe, but there were still plenty of quasi-Marxist supporters in Africa who were interested in buying weapons. And he developed a very effective business model. His growing fleet of planes, by the mid-90s, he had dozens of these old Antonovs and Ilyushin aircraft, were used to transport all sorts of cargo in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. His customers were both legitimate and illegitimate: the UN, multinational businesses, heads of states, warlords. He served everybody. The official customers provided him with the necessary documentation to avoid scrutiny. For instance, Liberia sold him their government aircraft register, which allowed him to register all of his aircraft in Liberia. And it's important that he had to start in Africa, where the road network is pretty primitive. Boots pilots, however, were willing to land just about anywhere. These were hardy aircraft and hardy pilots. To maximize profits, Boot always made sure he had something on board, whether it was frozen chickens, flowers, or AK-47s. Toward the end of the 90s, he moved his operations to the obscure airport in Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. The regulations in this sheikdom were rather lax. By the late 90s, folks who monitored conflict in Africa noticed a strange correlation. Wherever one of Boot's planes landed, there would be a subsequent uptick in violence. First it was folks like journalists and NGOs, then the intelligence agencies kind of made the same correlation. Boot, however, was a master at exploiting the holes and weaknesses within global trade. He would simply re-register his company, change the names and tail numbers, and by paying various bribes, was able to expand business and elude the authorities. And business was good. The end of the Cold War did not bring much of a peace dividend. Besides the many conflicts in Africa, he found his delivery services in demand in former Yugoslavia, Colombia, the Philippines. There's even reports that he possibly supplied rebels in Chechnya. Those are the quasi-legal. He also provided the UN with transport services to bring peacekeepers to Somalia, French troops to Rwanda, and humanitarian goods to post-tsunami Sri Lanka. Another promising market was Afghanistan. In the growing instability after the Soviet withdrawal, Boot was enlisted to help arm various warlords. By the late 90s, he was arming folks like Massoud in the Northern Alliance with tons of weapons. Boot claims that he never helped to arm the Taliban, but the evidence would seem to suggest otherwise. For instance, in '95, one of his planes was seized by the Taliban, and after a year of negotiations, he was able to get his crew and his plane back, and many assumed that he had to trade something to do this. Prior to 9/11, U.S. government agencies had become aware of Boot's deadly delivery operation, but there was a lack of international coordination, interagency bickering, and changing priorities. Some of this failure to act had to do with the uncharted waters and a perceived lack of jurisdiction. These were the days before extraordinary rendition, and there were no legal grounds for the U.S. authorities to arrest a foreign national, even if they were arming terrorist groups outside of the U.S. After 9/11, unfortunately, the intelligence focus shifted, and the U.S. became more interested in targeting the perpetrators and not the suspected supplier. There have been allegations that Boot helped to move U.S., CIA, and Special Forces into Afghanistan in October 2001. I could not find any corroborating evidence. In 2002, Belgian authorities put on an Interpol arrest warrant on him for money laundering and illegal weapons trafficking. Boot just didn't pay attention. If 9/11 caused some U.S. security officials to take their eyes off the activities of Boot, then the Iraq War resulted in a massive loss of focus and memory. War is hell, and getting supplies into coalition forces into Iraq was challenging. Defense officials were increasingly forced to subcontract delivery services to those freight companies who were willing to take risks and who were less concerned with safety and formal regulations. Supplying the troops was the first priority, and by changing tail numbers and company registration data, Boot was able to find a wide niche in this very lucrative market. Later evidence showed that from about 2003 up till 2005, he did a lot of business. Rough estimates are that he earned about $60 million in U.S. taxpayer dollars for his Iraq resupply efforts. When the Air Force found out that they were dealing with a known arms trafficker, this was in 2004, what did they do? They turned the issue over to the contracting office, and Victor Boot, continued to deliver supplies late into 2005. He might still be transporting supplies to Iraq and Afghanistan today had it not been for a number, and this is my opinion, journalists and screenwriters who highlighted his deadly business. In 2005, Lord of War was released with Nicolas Cage playing an arms trafficker who bore a resemblance to Boot. The director actually used a couple of Boot planes for a few scenes in the film. In a later interview, Boot said that the film was not very entertaining. This was followed in 2007 by a biography of Victor Boot. You can see it there, by Douglas Farrar and Stephen Braun. This is an interesting footnote to this presentation. Douglas Farrar is a KU grad, and I contacted him. He actually graduated from the School of Journalism and Latin American Studies. I contacted him with questions regarding Victor Boot and his research, and he was very forthcoming, very open with his answers. Had I discovered this earlier, Mr. Farrar would have been here this afternoon speaking to you. That's him and below Douglas Farrar. But up until this point, various intel agencies, international bodies, non-governmental organizations had gathered tons of evidence about what Mr. Boot had been up to. Some say that we had a lot of evidence. However, there was a lack of coordination and unity of effort. As a multinational arms trafficker, what agency, which country was responsible for closing down his operation? After the movie and the publication of this book, elements within the U.S. government began to take a more aggressive viewpoint toward putting Boot out of business. He was finally arrested in March 2008 in Bangkok, an elaborate sting operation where he was going to sell a whole arsenal of weapons to these guys, the FARC, down in Colombia. The actual conduct of this sting operation, how it was conducted, is a subject of another conference, or at least a Hollywood thriller. But he was arrested in March 2008, and at first you can see the smile on his face. I think he thought he could beat the rap. He has some pretty high friends, and he thought the Russian government could pull those strings necessary to get him out of prison. One of the items he was going to sell the FARC were the surface-to-air missiles. Those were just a perfect tool for knocking those pesky U.S. helicopters who were flying over those coca fields in Colombia. His detention in the Thai prison dragged on, however. And things weren't looking so good for Mr. Boot and his team of lawyers. There had been a change of administrations in both Washington and Moscow. The evidence against Boot is convincing. And if the Russian government fought too hard for his release, what message would this send to the Americans and their new reset policy? The Thai government was in a very delicate situation. While they had participated in the Boot arrest, some within the Thai government voiced concern over the Russian backlash should they turn him over to the Americans. I know that I shouldn't cite him, but in subsequent WikiLeaks reports, it was released that the Russian government were offering very lucrative oil and gas deals to the Thais, while the Americans were apparently offering advanced fighter weapons to the ties in exchange for Boot. Here's a couple of cartoons that reflect this horse trading that went on. This one. But in the end, but after 2.5 years of imprisonment in Thailand, Boot was extradited to the United States. We were able to convince the Thai authorities that Boot's removal to the U.S. was the right thing to do. On 17 November 2010, Boot arrived in New York under heavy DAA guard and has spent the last 5 months in a maximum security prison. In fact, I have a picture of it there. Maximum security prison in Manhattan, downtown New York City, awaiting his trial, which is scheduled to convene in October 2011. That's some of the evidence, some of his footnotes he was taking when he was dealing with the fake FARC rebels, what he was going to sell them. The Russian response was as expected. They said that the whole affair is a sample of blatant injustice. If found guilty, because Boot was transpiring to kill Americans, if found guilty, Boot could spend the rest of his life in prison. Shortly after his arrival, less than a week after his arrival in that New York prison, 60 Minutes, some people might say did a hatchet job, some people might say did a informative report dealing with the many sins of Victor Boot. They highlighted the clever sting operation conducted by the agents of the DEA. And Americans could now breathe a sigh of relief that this dangerous individual was now behind bars. He's continued to proclaim his innocence. I'm just an honest businessman who merely transports whatever I'm paid to carry, whether disaster relief supplies or attack helicopters. I'm only the delivery man. If you go to his website in English, you can read a quote that he puts, "I'm a born salesman with an undying love for aviation and an eternal drive to succeed." As far as I can tell, Boot is not cooperating with U.S. authorities, and he's been mounting a pretty effective defense. He's a smart guy who knows that his trial represents something bigger than his own innocence or guilt. Recall that he spent 2.5 years in a Thai prison, and he didn't reveal any trade secrets. Moreover, his family still resides in Russia, and this might provide a powerful incentive for him not to cooperate with the U.S. We can talk more about that later. What are some of the conclusions? What does this have to do with migrations, shadow economies, and security issues on the borders? Here's a couple of tentative ideas. First, the Bout case illustrates the weakness and perhaps the strengthening of international law enforcement. For over a decade, various governments and their associated intel agencies were well aware that Boot was profiting from the illegal transfer of weapons, and they failed to act. Some of this failure can be attributed to normal bureaucratic obtuseness, some to a perceived lack of jurisdiction, but mostly because of indifference and/or complicity. Many countries and companies were profiting from his questionable weapon deliveries and transport service. Second, despite his arrest, this case illustrates that there is still no recognized global police force. While we in the U.S. might believe that Captain America has a global mandate, this case shows that there's many who question this assertion. I can't tell you what, this is from a blog, a Russian blog, where they use the scene from, I don't know if you've seen the movie Minority Report, where the theme is before you commit a crime, because he had not committed a crime. You're arrested. This is off a Russian blog where they're describing that the U.S. has perhaps stepped over its bounds as to what its level of jurisdiction is. And finally, I think placing Boot behind bars is a step in the right direction. The evidence suggests that he helped to inflame conflicts around the globe. His successful prosecution might serve as a precedent and stem the tide of weapons being illegally traded around the world. I'm skeptical, however. war remains and security remains good business. The Victor Bout case is also important for what it says about modern conflict. War has always been a profitable business for weapon manufacturers. The commercialization or privatization of armed violence has opened up many new opportunities. And you can see there's Blackwater, its former CEO, Mr. Eric Prince, now rebranded as XE. He, by the way, has moved his headquarters before he gave up the company, right next to where Boot had his operation in Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. Moral questions about selling arms and services, this is my conclusion, moral questions about selling arms and services often take backseat to questions of profit and market share. And unfortunately, the laws surrounding how these firms operate are often ill-defined. One of the unintended consequences from the Cold War was the fallacious notion that war is good for business. There may be short-term gains from war profiteering, but the long-term result is always bad. Victor Boot understands this now, maybe he does, but there are many others who have yet to learn this lesson. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ray. We're going to listen to two more presentations before taking questions to all of the presenters. So next speaker is Ebenezer Abadara, who has just been promoted to the rank of Associate Professor of Sociology here at the University of Kansas. So the program still lists as an assistant professor. So he earned his PhD in social policy from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2005, and he has received many prestigious awards for his research. One of these awards is the MacArthur Foundation Research and Writing Grant. His articles have appeared in leading peer-reviewed Africanist journals such as African Affairs, the Journal of Modern African Studies, Africa Development, and many others. In 2008, Dr. Abadara was honored as the year's Virginia and Derek Sherman Emerging Scholar by the Department of History at the University of North Carolina. He is also the author of Africa Between the Old and the New, The Strange Persistence of the Post-Colonial State, and he's a co-editor of Encountering the Nigerian State. And the title of his talk is Paper Truth, External Lives, Authenticity and Fakery in the West African Shadow Economy.
Thank you, and thanks for the overblown compliments. Please enjoy the slide, because this is the only slide I have. Let me just quickly, say a couple of things about the slide. I'm going to be talking about primarily Nigeria, but this is the sub-region, that I'm interested in, and the market in alternative documentation economy that I'm going to be talking about. The capital is based right here in Lagos. So the economy, draws in clientele increasingly from these parts, of West Africa. So you move from here and then you come to Lagos, to get the kind of service I'm going to talk about, so that you can go across to the north. So nice enough for one slide. Okay. So the title of my paper is Paper Truth and Asia's Lives, Authenticity and Fakery in the West African Shadow Economy. And what I want to do is present to you the preliminary, my preliminary thoughts on the research that I started last year. And it's about the alternative market in travel documentation in West Africa. If the American High Commission would give you a visa to come to the United States, don't worry. There are plenty of people in Nigeria who can do the job for you. So I'm trying to understand what that market means in the context of the country's history, and I'm also taking you what a long durée look, situating it in the trajectory of post-colonial, formation of states in West Africa. And I'm going to tell you about, what the service itself entails, who the clientele are, what the service, the kinds of services that that you can get, and then I'll stop with about 4 or 5 reflections. Let me start with an anecdote, and it's an anecdote that is a true life situation about a friend of mine who in 2006 2006 won the American Green Visa Card Lottery. A few months after receiving the good news, my friend attended an interview at the American High Commission in Lagos in the company of her spouse. The couple's experience was a chastening one. Being Nigerians, they had expected a close scrutiny of their carefully collated documents, but not the ruthless invasion of privacy that the entire interview process turned out to be. To their surprise, the consular official accused my friend of not being married to her husband and trying to smuggle an illegal alien into the United States. So I'm going to quote my friend. I had an extended discussion with her, and I'm going to quote some of the things she said, because I think these things, she says it more powerfully than I can. This is about her experience at the embassy. The consular official asked me about archaeology, the course I read in the university, which I did. He asked when I and my husband got married, why we got married, and the wedding photographs. Then he asked me to go and sit down while he questioned my husband. He asked him, what side of the bed do I sleep on? What is the color of my toothbrush? The officer later repeated the same questions with me. Next, he consulted with two other officers and told us to come back 2 p.m. the same day. We thought they were going to give us a visa. At 2 p.m., we returned to the administrative area where I was taken upstairs by a woman who they refer to as a FPU extension 317. FPU is Fraud Prevention Unit. As this woman was taking me upstairs in the elevator, I leaned on the wall. She asked me if I'd ever been in an elevator before. I told her that I have, but that it makes me feel light on my feet. She told me in an insulting way, how do you then fly in an airplane? Well, that was just the tip of the iceberg. Our next question completely started. The woman asked me, when was the last time I had sex with my husband? She asked me if there were scars on my husband's body. When was our first kiss? She asked these questions in such a way that an American woman who was being interviewed in the same office, when the FPU woman had gone downstairs to bring my husband, asked me, what did you do? And why are they treating you like this? The FPU woman accused me and my husband of being siblings. We offered to do a DNA test at one point. She told me and my husband that we are liars. From 2 p.m. to 5 p.m., we were being questioned like criminals for something I had legitimately won. She asked us to bring my late mother-in-law's death certificate because she believed that my husband and I were born of the same mother. They were talking about a woman who died in 1980. However, we went digging and came up with the receipt of the vault where she was buried. When my husband was asked for his primary school result, he opted to get to his school to get it. The consular woman said she won't take it, that she wanted old ones that are faded with age, because our office has no time to go and verify. Anyone familiar with the process of applying and getting interviewed for a visa to a Western country in Nigeria will know that my friend's story is by no means exceptional. On the contrary, it is merely a page from a litany of humiliating and dehumanizing experiences to which visa applicants are subjected. Following the footsteps of sociologist Harold Garfinkel, I describe these experiences as a status degradation ceremony. For Garfinkel, a status degradation ceremony is any communicative work between persons whereby the public identity of an actor is transformed into something looked on as lower in the social scheme of social types. My research focuses on the Nigerian transnational visa economy. It is the label I've given to the motley of practices, private and institutional actors, institutions, and state and para-state agents that are involved in the production of alternative travel documentation for clients who hail from Nigeria and increasingly, as I said earlier, from other parts of West Africa. One claim that I make in this research is that the emergence and continued flourishing of this economy is traceable in part to these ceremonies of degradation. Let me explain. Visa ceremonies of degradation often involve what Gary Allen Fine, that's another sociologist, once described as demonization and the construction of non-personhood, meaning that visa applicants are basically labeled as criminals and treated as non-human beings. The example of my friend, which I gave earlier, validates these descriptions. To make sure that only real persons, meaning those with the correct papers go through the interview process and are admitted into America and other Western countries. Consular officials, literally speaking, erect a paper wall that only the most thorough and determined applicants can scale. Prospective applicants resort to the alternative documentation market, both as a strategy of avoiding humiliation and also to arrange the many documents which they are sure they will be required to provide. And I'm putting an emphasis on that arrange. Because once you know that they are going to ask for A, B, C, what people do is not to look for the correct things, because the correct documents may not certify the officials. You look for the documents that will work so that you can avoid humiliation and also that you can beat that paper wall. But the rigors of the interview process do not completely account for the existence of the market in alternative documentation. It is also, among other things, a fallout of a combination of several factors. The disembedding of the state from ordinary people's lives, the freeze in social mobility as a result of mass unemployment, and the appetite for elsewhere, partly fostered by the scarcity of opportunities for material reproduction and professional enhancement in post-Cold War, post-colonial West Africa. For a proper understanding of my research, let me pose two questions, which I'll try to answer. One, what does this market in alternative documentation signify in the context of everyday life, not just in Nigeria or West Africa, but in the rest of contemporary sub-Saharan Africa? Two, what are its mechanisms, logics, and procedures? So let me try and answer the first question. I think the industry is best seen as part of what I call a general economy of falsification. One in which the existence of an original document, a passport, a certificate, a travel visa, a CD, a DVD, the country's currency, or any currency for that matter, is almost seen as an invitation or a challenge to produce its double. A social context in which people have come to accept the existence of fake banks, fake academic conferences, I'm not talking about this one, forged electoral victories, fake soldiers, fake policemen, ghost workers, fake pastors, and last but not least, and arguably most important, a fake state. Clearly, not every Nigerian is involved in counterfeiting. On the contrary, my interest is in the moral struggles of ordinary Africans who are participants in perpetuating corruption in their country, though they do so in circumstances that are partly beyond their control. I want to suggest that the explanation for falsification, specifically the existence and flourishing of the economy in alternative travel documentation, requires an understanding of the intersection of youth discontent, social alienation, general destitution in the society, and an ambivalent attitude towards the West that involves a mix of adoration, repulsion, humiliation, and retaliation. The economy is also not comprehensible without reference to local forms of insertion into global flows that ordinarily do not concede initiatives or innovativeness to the denizens of the global south and the subaltern, the poor, and the destitute of the world in general. As a technology of access, and I want to reflect briefly on what the visa means. It's a technology of access and recess. The visa and other such permits and official documents consecrate and sanctify the state as the exclusive place, zone, provider, and instrument for the determination of what is genuine. At one level, you can argue that the historical grand conceit of the state, particularly its colonial manifestation, is challenged in this particular instance by the subaltern, who have been cast out or cast off by the state. Genuineness, therefore, becomes, in the zone of forgery and falsification, a play on the access and authority which the state backs up by its capacity to mobilize exclusive violence and compel and command obedience. In the forgery zone, the state sovereignty is therefore mimicked by those with the capacity to make the double of official authorization through access to practical ingenuity, Again, you think about technology and globalization, and the mobilization of both legal and illegal resources, which invest them with counterfeit authority. Most of us, particularly Americans, are accustomed to seeing life as a straightforward contest between legality and illegality. On one level, of course, it is. But one issue that I have to contend with as a student of African politics is the eternal post-colonial duel between what seems morally legitimate, even though the law may have declared it illegal. A defining feature of African modernity is the intervention of the legal and the illegal. In a post-colonial context where legality is often determined in the context of particular relationships, the recourse to alternatives is not just a reflection of this interface. Fundamentally, I claim, it is a symbol of a particular attitude to political modernity itself. This time, modernity has constituted in the post-colonial state and a system of law. Using the notion of the two publics, historical sociological scholarship in Africa has described how the same social actors within an African community will relate to the primordial and the civic publics on the basis of ostensibly contradictory moral principles. The connection here is that an important part of the reasons why people feel little or no compunction about this market, textual simulation in general, especially when it comes to state regulation, is that for most people, the state has always been something that exists out there, as opposed to in here. As such, even among so-called state functionaries, many of whom patronize this market, there is usually no serious guilt attached to deceiving or getting something at the expense of a state whose own ethical foundations and moral bona fides are seen as questionable at best. I want to finish by reflecting on the mechanisms and procedures, and if people ask me questions about this, I can say more about it. The kind of the division of labor you have within the industry, the various modes of falsification, how to boost your passport, how to transplant somebody else's passport, a photograph from one passport to another, depending on, so it depends on what you need at a particular point in time. And, there are, different kinds of success rate and all of that. Who are the collaborators? Who works within these industries? Nigerian law enforcement agents, the police, they give tips to the people who work. They conduct fake arrests and they release those that have been, formally arrested. Embassy officials, including American officials working, in Nigeria, embassy investigation officers, Americans, immigrations, customs officials, bank officials, especially because these days, one of the most important documents you need is a good bank account. And you're talking about a context in which many people don't have jobs. So when consular officials insist on a very healthy bank account, this economy gives the embassy what it wants. So what kind of documents can you get through this economy? Your degree certificate, bank account, college diplomas, foreign and local. Anybody wants a KU degree, it's available for $25. Travel visas, travel stamps, in and out, college entrance exam, admission letters, national service discharge certificate, business registration certificates, tax clearance certificates. And then part of what they also do is what you call pre-departure coaching. Again, there's no time, but I can talk more about this. So this is done by people who have traveled in the past, maybe who were deported. So part of what they do is if you are going to London, they give you a map of, an A to Z of and they say, so where is Waterloo Station? And then you've never been out, you're supposed to say, Waterloo Station is, if you turn right when you come out of Waterloo Station, what's there? You say, oh, Sainsbury's. If you go left, what's there? Oh, this bookstore, so that you imitate knowledge of where you're going. Let me I have about 5, conclusions. I'm going to read just 2, because of time. One is that the market has grown out of and continues to be nourished by a widespread among both producers and their clients that what the people I spoke to call this old documentation thing is an innately amoral game that is won or lost, not necessarily because of the basic authenticity or validity of one's papers, but how well one is able to arrange those papers. In this sense, procuring relevant travel documentation is more about generating the necessary papers in order to satisfy bureaucracy, rather than actually producing authentic papers that consular officials may reject. One can say that in the Nigerian public imagination, there are truths and there are paper truths. The second, I have 5 things, but let me just read one more, then I'll keep quiet. One is to reflect on the morality that subtends the entire economy. And here, I'll make just 4 related observations. One is that most of those who work in the industry that are interviewed are convinced that if at all they are committing a crime, it is a victimless crime. In fact, many of them think that they are doing something charitable, to the extent that what they do ultimately helps other people to actualize their dreams of traveling to the West. Second, there's a notion of doing anything to get one over a Western world that is indirectly responsible for the country's woes through colonialism. Third, and related to that, some see getting one over the West, especially the US and the UK, as part of a moral debt that these countries owe African countries. Fourth, and finally, there's an ambivalent attitude in the general society toward their activities, with some people refusing to blame young people who are doing their best to stay afloat in a generally harsh environment, not helped by the criminality of the state itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last presenter for this afternoon is Dr. Nadia Shapkina, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Kansas State University. She's also a native of Russia who graduated from Saratov State Technical University, based in Russia, and received her master's degree in sociology from Central European University in Poland. She completed her PhD studies in sociology at Georgia State University. Dr. Shapkina studies global commodity chains as applied to commercial sex trade industry, as well as transnational anti-trafficking organizing. And the title of her presentation, which is also up on the slide, is Survival and Gendered Risks of Migration in Central Asia, Shifting Sex Trafficking Flows in the Asian Heartland.
Right. So my research deals with human trafficking and anti-trafficking campaigns, and particularly for this presentation, I kind of look at different flows, migrant flows, and how they result in the risks of sex trafficking of women. Right. I look at a particular configuration of a particular kind of constellation of countries and particular flows from Eastern Europe to Turkey and from Central Asia to Turkey. Turkey is one of the cases that I added recently to my kind of sample of countries that I investigate. And once I traveled to Turkey and I found myself interviewing people in Istanbul, I asked them about Eastern European migrants. I was particularly interested in migrants from Ukraine, Russia, and Moldova. And they informed me, law enforcement officers and non-profit representatives and international organizations people, they informed me that well, we don't have many migrants, victims of trafficking from Eastern Europe. And I was like, what are you talking about? This is the destination country, right, for our migrants. But apparently the supply of victims have dried up. So that was kind of a good news, right, that women are not becoming victims of sex trafficking as before in the beginning of 2000, 2001 until 2005. But this flow of migrants didn't stop, right? They still continue coming, and they kind of assume more shuttle migration pattern. They come and they travel back home, and then they come again. But the victims of trafficking primarily came from Central Asia, starting 2005 and 2006, 2007. So there is this kind of profound shift shift in who is being victimized in this sex trafficking chains, and I was interested in the reasons for this shift. So my main question was what kind of factors contribute to this shifting migrant flows, right? The Central Asian migrants are coming to Turkey, but also why do some of them become victims of sex trafficking? So my data comes from participant observation, primarily with non-profits, Human Resource Development Foundation in Istanbul, and with international organizations, mostly IOM in Istanbul and Ankara, and from interviews with different other non-profits and governmental officials, law enforcement officials, etc. So we have a map of Turkey. Most of the identified victims of trafficking, and most of the victims are victims of sex trafficking, were found in around Istanbul and the south of Turkey, around the tourist district of Antalya, right down there. And some victims came from were identified in Izmir and Trabzon, northwest of Turkey, but most of the victims, like the total majority of victims, were identified in Istanbul and Antalya, approximately 50-50%. So, what are these flows, and what kind of determines the position of the country in this whole geopolitical reality? For Turkey, which is a destination country, one of the key factors is the development strategy or development policy of Turkey via tourism that create a demand in service workers, especially in restaurant businesses and hotels, in clubs and recreation, in the sex trade as well. Many women who take these positions, many women who traveled to take these positions were promised this type of work, service work. At the same time, what's going on in Turkey is that sex trade is growing. It's legalized in Turkey, but it's legalized only for citizens, right? You have to get licensed. There are licensed brothels, but there are also other forms of sex trade, primarily club and hotel prostitution and apartment-based prostitution. What makes Turkey a desirable destination, or an easy destination, also is that Turkey has easy entry strategy, right? For this first wave of migrants from Moldova, Russia, Ukraine, from Eastern Europe, it's just a tourist visa, right, up to like 30 days, and I think it was extended for 3 months, which you can just buy at the airport. And for CARs, for Central Asian republics, this new visa regulation was added kind of recently, quite recently, 2006, 2007, for different countries. So that was one of the key factors why people were able to travel more easily to Turkey and staying there. Cheap means of transportation, right? For Eastern European migrants, there's this daily ferry from Odessa to Istanbul, and there are also international flights available as well. So for the first wave, Ukraine, Russia particularly, we are talking about integration of these countries into the global economy that opened up the borders and made travel possible. We are talking about a tradition or history of shuttle trade migration. There are some networks established, so that kind of creates this permanent migration movements. But also in terms of how this migration affects women, these countries have witnessed quite a gender transition to capitalism. feminization of poverty, feminization of unemployment, domestic violence is a problem, and also kind of the revival of neo-traditionalist gender ideologies to a certain extent that facilitates this idea that women, first of all, men have to be employed and then only women, right? So that kind of creates this context of gender discrimination. I have included a couple of gender empowerment measures, and you can see how actually Ukraine measure up against the United States. So in terms of rank, it's kind of like down there. Turkey, I think the measure is 0.35, so it's even lower than Eastern Europe, and rank is 101. And for Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, I was not able even to find the gender empowerment measure. I guess the statistics was not collected. Central Asian republics. Migrants primarily come from Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, and so are victims of sex trafficking, primarily from these four countries. And you know, and there was already some discussion of how Kazakhstan's economy is doing a little bit better, and there's not such push of out-migration. Major decline in living standards in this region, political instability, civil conflicts, collapse of state institutions. We are talking about, for example, some regions in Tajikistan not providing immunization to children, not able to get immunization in mountainous regions. And a friend of mine from Tajikistan, she was ill with typhoid, so there is kind of this return of the diseases that we thought and we already conquered. Growing informal economy. People use migration as a survival, kind of as in sociology we say survival circuits. Of course, the problems with the governance structure, corruption, in terms of gender inequality, same revival of traditionalist ideologies. We hear some kind of discourses about decreasing the age of consent for women. We are talking. There are discussions about polygamy and kind of gender discrimination, and impoverishment is widespread. So here's some data in estimated income broken down by gender. And you can see that. Of course, there is this famous gender wage gap, and it's also quite prominent in all of these Central Asian republics. So overall income classification by the World Bank is primarily low, lower middle in terms of Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. And there is also, of course, a factor of national debt, right? And Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, the indebtedness is quite severe, right? And it also affects what the state can provide for the citizens, especially for women, for families, for socially vulnerable groups. If the state has this high degree of indebtedness, obviously there's not much in terms of social services. So I look usually at organization of global trafficking chains, and if we break down this whole process of human trafficking, we can talk about different stages: recruitment, transportation, and exploitation itself. So in terms of recruitment, what contributes to the increase in recruitment is the lack of employment opportunities, obviously unemployment, and lack of legal means to migrate. And in this context, recruitment happens through primarily informal channels, and different migration networks are used, and deception is quite widespread in recruitment in different, whether it happens through some kind of employment agency or through acquaintance. Also, there is this shuttle trade connections with not only Turkey but also Greece and United Arab Emirates. In terms of transportation, that determines how dangerous and how risky the travel of migrants is, and transportation can be, or border crossing can be legal and illegal. So because of the new visa regulation, migrants come to Turkey from Central Asian republics on tourist visas, but they typically overstay their visas, right? So they become irregular migrants. So this is the largest proportion of this migrant population in Turkey. They are irregular migrants who overstay their visas. Smuggling, illegal smuggling also happens, but more in connection to drug trafficking and transit migration from like Iran, from the east and toward the European Union. There are not so many known cases of large criminal organizations involved in human trafficking in Turkey. It's obviously not the case of like Albanian mafia or Russian mafia or Chinese mafia, but rather trafficking happens in the context of smaller, flexible groups who are involved or that are involved on kind of opportunity basis. If they see an opportunity to make profit, to capitalize, they are using people by selling people. Modern technologies, of course, also facilitate this whole process, and women also travel to Turkey independently without male companion. Like, for example, in Gulf states, some of them require male companionship for women who are under 30 years old. So to Turkey, it's kind of easier. Right. Exploitation. So because of the status of irregular migrants, they usually don't have access to legal work, right? They cannot become legal residents, they cannot work legally. So often they have to be kind of employed in informal sector of economy and get irregular jobs. Sometimes they are described as 3D type, dirty, difficult, and dangerous. Women are also exploited as women, not only as migrants. Women's work is, women are often employed in specific occupations like domestic service, like sex trade, and any other type of service labor. And at the same time, women are often exploited as workers or indentured servitude, servants, because they accumulate debt from these travel arrangements, and sometimes it ranges between 10 and 15,000 euros, and they have to repay all of this debt. So how we can understand the sex trade configurations in Turkey? Split labor market theory is kind of useful tool here. Split labor market basically argues that market has two niches. One is the formal labor market with official employment and it's regulated and labor laws are enforced, and the informal employment, that's where supplementary labor market comes in, is kind of not so well compensated, and there are dangers associated with employment in this sector of labor market, which are trafficking and sex trafficking, labor trafficking and sex trafficking. So why is this shift in sex trafficking flows? So something was going on with Eastern European population, and what I think was happening based on the data that I collected, the anti-trafficking campaigns in Russia and Ukraine, I didn't study Moldova in depth, but Russia and Ukraine, awareness campaigns were kind of successful and people became more cautious, and they know the dangers problem. So they make sure that if they even migrate, that their migration is safe. At the same time, some of the flows of migration became more established, and the networks became more established, so that we even know that in Antalya, some of these Eastern European sex workers, they kind of become the dominant force in the sex trade in Antalya. They dominate the market. They kind of, to a certain extent, control the market. Some of these women became the pimps, the organizers of those networks, and so there's no kind of need to buy people and sell people and exploit people. There is a constant supply of sex workers from Moldova. That's why some of the women who come to work in Turkey, they don't apply for recognition, for being recognized as victim of sex trafficking. But not the case with Central Asian women who are newcomers to this market, and they don't have such patterns established. They don't have those networks. They don't know those club owners, and they are taken advantage of by these traffickers. At the same time, there's insufficient law enforcement of recruitment agents. There is no prosecution of traffickers. There's no kind of legal framework that would criminalize and penalize this type of violation of human rights. Also, I needed to say that Central Asia, Turkey is not the only destination for Central Asia, but also Thailand, China, South Korea, and Israel, Greece, Italy sometimes. For example, Uzbek women have replaced Moldovans as the most common nationality of trafficked women detected in Israel, according to the U.S. Department of State. So obviously it's not only happening in Turkey, right? Central Asian women, kind of this new wave of migrants, but at the same time they are, as newcomers to the sex trade, they are the most